Section 20 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2, by Anonymous, translated by Dr. Jonathan Scott, 1754 to 1829. The story of the loves of Kummir Al Zummaun, prince of the Isles of the children of Khaledan, and of Badoura, princess of China, Part 1. About 20 days' sail from the coast of Persia there are islands in the main ocean called the Islands of the children of Khaledan. These islands are divided into 4 great provinces, which have all of them very flourishing and populous cities, forming together a powerful kingdom. It was formerly governed by a king named Shah Zummaun, who had 4 lawful wives, all daughters of kings, and 60 concubines. Shah Zummaun thought himself the most happy monarch of the world on account of his peaceful and prosperous reign. One thing only disturbed his happiness, which was that he was advanced in years and had no children, though he had so many wives. He knew not to what to attribute this barrenness, and what increased his affliction was that he was likely to leave his kingdom without a successor. He dissembled his discontent, and this dissimulation only heightened his uneasiness. At length he broke silence, and one day after he had complained bitterly of his misfortune to his Grand Vizier, he asked him if he knew any remedy for it. That wise minister replied, "If what your Majesty requires of me had depended on the ordinary rules of human wisdom, you had soon had an answer to your satisfaction, but my experience and knowledge fall far short of your question. It is to God only that we can apply in cases of this kind. In the midst of our prosperities, which often tempt us to forget him, he is pleased to mortify us in some instance, that we may address our thoughts to him, acknowledge his omnipotence, and ask of him what we ought to expect from him alone. Your Majesty has subjects," proceeded he, "who make a profession of honoring and serving God, and suffering great hardships for his sake. To them I would advise you to have recourse, and engage them by alms to join their prayers with yours. Perhaps some one among them may be so pure and pleasing to God as to obtain a hearing for your prayers." Shah Zummaun approved this advice, and thanked his vizier. He immediately caused alms to be given to every community of these holy men in his dominions, and having sent for the superiors, declared to them his intention, and desired them to acquaint their devout men with it. The king obtained of heaven what he requested, for in 9 months' time he had a son by one of his wives. To express his gratitude to heaven, he sent fresh alms to the communities of devotees, and the prince's birthday was celebrated not only in his capital, but throughout his dominions for a whole week. The prince was brought to him as soon as born, and he found him so beautiful that he gave him the name of Kummir Al Zummaun, or Moon of the Age. He was brought up with all imaginable care, and when he had arrived at a proper age, his father appointed him an experienced governor and able preceptors. These persons, distinguished by their capacity, found in him a ready wit, capable of receiving all the instructions that were proper to be given him, as well as in relation to morals as other knowledge which a prince ought to possess. As he grew up, he learned all his exercises, and acquitted himself with such grace and wonderful address as to charm all that saw him, and particularly the Sultan his father. When he had attained the age of 15, the Sultan, who tenderly loved him, and gave him every day new marks of his affection, proposed to afford a still higher demonstration by resigning his throne to him, and he accordingly acquainted his Grand Vizier with his intentions. "I fear," said he, "lest my son should lose, in the inactivity of youth, those advantages which nature and my education have given him. Therefore, since I am advanced in age, and ought to think of retirement, I propose to resign the government to him, and pass the remainder of my days in the satisfaction of seeing him reign. I have borne the fatigue of a crown till I am weary of it, and think it is now proper for me to retire." The Grand Vizier declined offering all the reasons he could have alleged to dissuade the Sultan from such a proceeding. On the contrary, he appeared to acquiesce with him in his opinion. "Sir," replied he, "the Prince is yet but young, and it would not, in my humble opinion, be advisable to burden him with the weight of a crown so soon. Your Majesty fears, with great reason, his youth may be corrupted by indolence, but to avoid this danger, do not you think it would be proper to marry him? Marriage forms attachment and prevents dissipation. Your Majesty might then admit him of your council, where he would learn by degrees the art of reigning, and so be prepared to receive your authority whenever by your own experience you shall think him qualified." Shah Zuman approved the advice of his prime minister, and summoned the prince to appear before him at the same time that he dismissed the Grand Vizier. The prince, who had been accustomed to see his father only at certain times without being sent for, was a little startled at this summons. When therefore he came into his presence, he saluted him with great respect, and stood with his eyes fixed on the ground. The Sultan, perceiving his constraint, addressed him with great mildness. "Do you know, son, for what reason I have sent for you?" The prince modestly replied, "God alone knows the heart. I shall hear it from your Majesty with pleasure." "I sent for you," resumed the Sultan, "to inform you that it is my intention to provide a proper marriage for you. What do you think of my design?" The prince heard this with great uneasiness. He was greatly agitated, and knew not what answer to make. After a few moments' silence, he replied, "Sir, I beseech you to pardon me if I seem surprised at the declaration you have made. I did not expect such proposals at my present age. I know not whether I could prevail on myself to marry, on account of the trouble incident to a married life, and the many treacheries of women which I have read of. I may not be always of the same mind, yet I conceive it will require time to determine on what your Majesty requires of me." The prince's answer extremely afflicted his father. He was not a little grieved to discover his aversion to marriage, yet would not charge him with disobedience, nor exert his paternal authority. He contented himself with telling him he would not force his inclinations, but give him time to consider of the proposal, and reflect that a prince destined to govern a great kingdom ought to take some care to leave a successor, and that in giving himself that satisfaction he communicated it to his father, who would be glad to see himself revive in his son and his issue. Shah Zuman said no more to the prince, but admitted him into his council, and gave him every reason to be satisfied. At the end of the year he took him aside and said to him, "My son, have you thoroughly considered what I proposed to you last year about marrying? Will you still refuse me that pleasure I expect from your obedience, and suffer me to die without affording me that satisfaction?" The prince seemed less disconcerted than before, and was not long answering his father to this effect: "Sir, I have not neglected to consider of your proposal, but after the maturest reflection find myself more confirmed in my resolution to continue in a state of celibacy. The infinite mischief which women have caused in the world, and which are on record in our histories, and the accounts I daily hear to their disadvantage, are the motives which powerfully influence me against having anything to do with them, so that I hope your Majesty will pardon me if I presume to tell you it will be in vain to solicit me any further upon this subject." As soon as he had thus spoken, he quitted the Sultan abruptly, without waiting his answer. Any monarch but Shah Zuman would have been angry at such freedom in a son, and would have made him repent. But he loved him, and preferred gentle methods before he proceeded to compulsion. He communicated this new cause of discontent to his prime minister. "I have followed your advice," said he, "but Kummir Al Zummaun is farther than ever from complying with my desires." He delivered his determination in such free terms that it required all my reason and moderation to keep my temper. Fathers who so earnestly desire children as I did this son are fools, who seek to deprive themselves of that rest which it is in their own power to enjoy without control. Tell me, I beseech you, how I shall reclaim a disposition so rebellious to my will." "Sir," answered the grand vizier, "patience brings many things about that before seemed impracticable, but it may be this affair is of a nature not likely to succeed that way. Your Majesty will have no cause to reproach yourself for precipitation, if you would give the prince another year to consider your proposal. If in this interval he return to his duty, you will have the greater satisfaction, as you will have employed only paternal love to induce him, and if he still continue averse when this is expired, your Majesty may in full council observe that it is highly necessary for the good of the state that he should marry, and it is not likely he will refuse to comply before so grave an assembly, which you honour with your presence." The sultan, who so anxiously desired to see his son married, thought this long delay an age. However, though with much difficulty, he yielded to his grand vizier's reasons, which he could not disapprove. After the grand vizier was gone, the sultan went to the apartment of the mother of Prince Kummir Al Zummaun, to whom he had often expressed his desire to see the prince married. When he had told her, with much concern, how his son had a second time refused to comply with his wishes, and the indulgence which, by the advice of his grand vizier, he was inclined to show him, he said, "I know he has more confidence in you than he has in me, and will be more likely to attend to your advice. I therefore desire you would take an opportunity to talk to him seriously, and urge upon him that if he persists in his obstinacy, he will oblige me to have recourse to measures which would be disagreeable to me, and which would give him cause to repent having disobeyed me." Fatima, for so was the lady called, told the prince, the first time she saw him, that she had been informed of his second refusal to marry, and how much chagrin his resolution had occasioned his father. "Madam," replied the prince, "I beseech you not to renew my grief upon that head. I fear, under my present uneasiness, something may escape me which may not be consistent with the respect I owe you." Fatima judged from this answer that this was not a proper time to speak to him, and therefore deferred what she had to say to another opportunity. Some considerable time after, Fatima thought she had found a more favorable season, which gave her hopes of being heard upon that subject. "Son," said she, "I beg of you, if it be not disagreeable, to tell me what reason you have for your great aversion to marriage. If it be the wickedness of some women, nothing can be more unreasonable and weak. I will not undertake the defense of those that are bad. There are a great number of them undoubtedly, but it would be the height of injustice on their account to condemn all the sex. Alas, my son, you have in your books read of many bad women who have occasioned great mischief, and I will not excuse them, but you do not consider how many monarchs, sultans, and other princes there have been in the world, whose tyrannies, barbarities, and cruelties astonish those that read of them as well as myself. Now for one wicked woman you will meet with 1,000 tyrants and barbarians, and what torment do you think must a good woman undergo who is matched with any of these wretches?" "Madam," replied the prince, "I doubt not there are a great number of wise, virtuous, good, affable, and well-behaved women in the world. Would to God they all resembled you! But what deters me is the hazardous choice a man is obliged to make, and oftentimes one has not the liberty of following his inclination. Let us suppose then, madam," continued he, "that I had a mind to marry, as the sultan my father so earnestly desires. What wife, think you, would he be likely to provide for me? Probably a princess whom he would demand of some neighbouring prince, and who would think it an honour done him to send her. Handsome or ugly, she must be taken. Nay, suppose no other princess excelled her in beauty, who can be certain that her temper would be good, that she would be affable, complacent, easy, obliging, and the like, that her conversation would generally turn on solid subjects, and not on dress, fashions, ornaments, and 1,000 such fooleries, which would disgust any man of sense. In a word, that she would not be haughty, proud, arrogant, impertinent, scornful, and waste an estate in frivolous expenses, such as gay clothes, jewels, toys, and foolish, mistaken magnificence. You see, madam, continued he, by one single article, how many reasons a man may have to be disgusted at marriage. Let this princess be ever so perfect, accomplished, and irreproachable in her conduct, have yet a great many more reasons not to alter my opinion and resolution. What, son, exclaimed Fatima, have you then more reasons after those you have already alleged? I do not doubt of being able to answer them, and stop your mouth with a word. You may proceed, madam, returned the prince, and perhaps I may find a reply to your answer. I mean, son, said Fatima, that it is easy for a prince, who has had the misfortune to marry such a wife as you describe, to get rid of her, and take care that she may not ruin the state. Ah, madam, replied the prince, but you do not consider what a mortification it would be to a person of my quality to be obliged to come to such an extremity. Would it not have been more for his honour and quiet that he had never run such a risk? But, son, said Fatima once more, as you take the case, I apprehend you have a mind to be the last king of your race, who have reigned so long and gloriously over the isles of the children of Khaledan. Madam, replied the prince, for myself I do not desire to survive the king my father, and if I should die before him, it would be no great matter of wonder, since so many children have died before their parents. But it is always glorious to a race of kings that it should end with a prince worthy to be so, as I should endeavour to make myself, like my predecessors, and like the first of our race. From that time Fatima had frequent conferences with her son the prince on the same subject, and she omitted no opportunity or argument to endeavour to root out his aversion to the fair sex. But he eluded all her reasonings by such arguments as she could not well answer, and continued unaltered. The year expired, and to the great regret of the Sultan, Prince Kummir Al Zummaun gave not the least proof of having changed his sentiments. One day, therefore, when there was a great council held, the prime vizier, the other viziers, the principal officers of the crown, and the generals of the army being present, the Sultan thus addressed the prince: My son, it is now a long while since I expressed to you my earnest desire to see you married, and I imagined you would have had more complaisance for a father who required nothing unreasonable of you than to oppose him so long. But after such a resistance on your part, which has almost worn out my patience, I have thought fit to propose the same thing once more to you in the presence of my council. It is not merely to oblige a parent that you ought to have acceded to my wish. The well-being of my dominions requires your compliance, and this assembly join with me in expecting it. Declare yourself, then, that your answer may regulate my proceedings. The prince answered with so little reserve, or rather with so much warmth, that the Sultan, enraged to see himself thwarted by him in full council, exclaimed, How, unnatural son, have you the insolence to talk thus to your father and Sultan? He ordered the guards to take him away, and carry him to an old tower that had been long unoccupied, where he was shut up, with only a bed, a little furniture, some books, and one slave to attend him. Kummir Al Zummaun, thus deprived of liberty, was nevertheless pleased that he had the freedom to converse with his books, which made him regard his confinement with indifference. In the evening he bathed and said his prayers, and after having read some chapters in the Koran, with the same tranquillity of mind as if he had been in the Sultan's palace, he undressed himself and went to bed, leaving his lamp burning by him while he slept. End of Section 20.